Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Gregg Kimball with the Library of Virginia. I'm the Director of Public Services and Outreach here. During our program tonight, we're going to be speaking with Dr. Joshua Rothman. He is a professor of history at the University of Alabama. And of course, we're going to be talking about his new book, The Ledger and the Chain. Dr. Rothman has written extensively a couple really fine books that he published before this one called Notorious in the Neighborhood, Sex and Families Across the Color Line in Virginia, as well as Flush Times and Fever Dreams, a story of capitalism and slavery in the age of Jackson. So obviously Dr. Rothman has a long background in studying the institution of slavery. This is how we'll kind of do things tonight. We'll let Dr. Rothman tell us a little bit about the book and sort of set up what it's all about and the themes. We'll then have a conversation. I've got a lot of questions. It's a fascinating book. And then about 45 minutes, 50 minutes into the conversation, we're going to start to solicit. Well, you can put your questions in anytime you like. And we'll start to look at those and field some of those. So please do include those questions. I think that our education assistant tonight, Emma, is also going to be putting some things in the chat for some things programs that we'll be doing in the future, so you can know a little bit more about what we're up to. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Rothman to give us just an overview of his book, some of the key themes. So welcome.
Thank you, Gregg. It's good to see you. And thank you for doing this conversation, to the Library of Virginia for having me. I always love. I was going to say coming back to the Library of Virginia, which I do genuinely love, and I wish I was there, but here we are. And thanks to everybody who's on the Zoom for coming out and being interested in the book. I do want to leave as much time as possible for our conversation and for questions. So really what I'm going to do is just provide a kind of brief overview of what the book is about, why I think it matters, and sort of, throw a few things on the table for us to think about. The Ledger and the Chain traces the lives and careers of Isaac Franklin, John Armfield, and Bryce Ballard, who were the most important domestic slave traders in American history. And by the domestic slave trade, I'm referring to the buying and selling of enslaved people within the boundaries of the United States. Now, the domestic trade was something that pre-existed the United States itself, but it really took off in the 19th century as the nation expanded into what was then the Southwest, as white farmers flocked there to capitalize on Indian dispossession and the growth of the cotton economy, and as the federal ban on the transatlantic slave trade took hold starting in 1808, and that left farmers who were moving into that part of the country, if they wanted enslaved laborers, they had no choice but to acquire them domestically, presuming that they were going to acquire them legally at least. And slave traders fed this demand. And no one played a bigger role in the slave trade industry than the man at the center of my book. Through their company, which was commonly known as Franklin and Armfield, they trafficked roughly 10,000 enslaved people from the Upper South, particularly from Maryland and Virginia, to the Lower South, particularly to Louisiana and Mississippi. They did it very quickly. The company was founded in 1828. It effectively stopped dealing in human beings in 1836. And yet, in that relatively short period of time, Franklin, Armfield, and Ballard transformed the domestic slave trade, turning it from something white men might do in the short term for extra money into a profession, into a big business, something that could yield tremendous wealth for its operators. And in doing that, they established a business model for the slave trade that other traders would follow and build upon for decades. But of course, their impact went well beyond the slave trade business itself. By selling the labor, the bodies, the asset values of enslaved people, they made possible the expansion of the cotton and sugar economies. And the cotton economy in particular sat at the heart not just of Southern economic growth, but of American economic growth before the Civil War. And the capital that was extracted from the enslaved as they were bought and trafficked and sold and forced to labor, that capital circulated throughout the entire country and ultimately across the Atlantic Ocean as well. And of course, slave traders and the slave trade absolutely ravaged the families and the communities of the enslaved people they trafficked in. And the numbers of those people were enormous. Between 1800 and 1860, roughly 1 million enslaved people were forcibly migrated across state lines. At least twice as many were bought and sold within the boundaries of individual states. All told, an enslaved person was sold somewhere in the United States roughly every 3.5 minutes for decades. And so the book also uses the stories of Franklin, Armfield, and Ballard to trace the broader ebbs and flows of this domestic trade over time, watching it grow and expand in the early 19th century, stagger under the blows of financial disruptions, and then rise again out of the Depression, only to become nearly as big as it had ever been by the outbreak of the Civil War that finally brought it to an end. So the book covers a lot of the history of slavery, of the slave trade, its relationship to the American economy. It focuses on a story of several men in particular and their business that were central to that history. And it is a difficult history to deal with. This is not an easy book. But among the hardest things that the book demonstrates is that neither the slave trade nor slave traders ever really suffered for the criticism they faced from the small number of American anti-slavery activists. In fact, quite the opposite. They flourished, both socially and economically. And ideas to the contrary, which I think people who've heard about the slave trade have probably heard ideas to the contrary, and that's because they were things that Americans often said about the slave trade. They were things that Americans often said about slave traders, both at the time and for more than a century after the Civil War ended. But those ideas, they're mostly myths. And the fact that they are myths, the fact that the slave trade was a ubiquitous, profitable, widely accepted element of American life before the Civil War, the fact that slave traders could be understood as respectable businessmen, vital to American development, all of that says I think, some deeply uncomfortable things about the history of the United States. But they're things that I think we need to face squarely and that we need to learn how to grapple with. So that's kind of an overview of what the book does, what I hope it accomplishes. And I guess, I'd like to hear sort of what everybody has to say about it and what your thoughts are, questions, and Gregg, have at it.
Okay. Thank you for that overview. Playing off of what you said, one of the things I found really striking, and I guess one of those things as a historian I probably thought I knew, but really jumped out in your book, and that is that connection between Indian removal of the indigenous people being their land stolen and forced migrated, and connected then to the domestic slave trade. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So, the dispossession and the expulsion of Native Americans from the Southeast, really, for eventually from the continent, but in this period, really, we're looking at the Southeast. There's sort of a couple of big moments for that. There's during and after the War of 1812, and then of course there's again during the presidency of Andrew Jackson. And every time Indian nations are forcibly removed, that does several things. One thing it does is it opens up that landscape for cotton production, right? I mean, Indian nations are sitting on some of the best cotton land on the continent, and white farmers have their eyes on it pretty much as soon as they know that the cotton economy can be a thing. So one thing that it does is it opens up the landscape more and more and more over time. But it's not just that, right? So once that landscape is open, once you have white farmers who are going in to settle on that land, they're going to try to grow cotton and increase cotton production. So that increases the demand for enslaved laborers, right? So that helps create this growing market for slave traders. But it's more than just that, right? I mean, that kind of connection you can sort of get. What I think is sort of escapes most people is that when Native Americans are expelled from their land, the land doesn't go right away to white settlers. It goes to the federal government. The federal government then turns around, divvies up that property, and sells it cheap to white farmers. The money that's coming into the federal government goes into the Treasury, it goes into the Second Bank of the United States, and then that money is in turn pumped right back into the cotton economy. Now, not all of it, obviously, but huge portions of the investments of the Second Bank of the United States are in the Southwest. So it's this intertwining of theft of Indian land, theft of enslaved people, and the money that is going to do that, it basically is sort of selling off land that's been stolen and then pumping the money back in that's used to purchase enslaved people. So all of it is just deeply intertwined with each other. And it's really, once you sort of get a sense of the overall scope of it, the depth of not just sort of the dual atrocities of the slave trade and Indian removal, but the way that the government plays into this, the way that capitalism plays into it, all of it is right there.
And on that point, you know, I thought a lot about this myself, working for a state institution that was founded in 1823, when some of the things that you're talking about in your book were going on. It wasn't just the federal government, but every layer of government was implicated in the trade. And I think that's an interesting, you know, thing that, again, people might not really think about. Could you talk a little bit more about that? How government supported this, you know, enterprise and human beings?
Yeah, I mean, there's any number of ways in which that's true, right? So at the federal government level, it's not just the things I've described, but it's the fact that the domestic slave trade is interstate commerce, right? I mean, we don't like to think of enslaved people as commercial products, but before the Civil War, that is what they are in law. The Constitution lays out, it doesn't lay out a lot of things very clearly, but one thing it lays out very clearly is among the powers of Congress is the power to regulate interstate commerce. Congress had within its authority to do something about the interstate slave trade. It never does, never. You know, in 1850, right, they contain it within the Federal District of Columbia. That's it. But they never do any, they effectively sanction the slave trade because they don't do anything about it. If anything, when they have shipping, which, you know, a lot of slave traders are, long distance traders are putting people on ships down the Atlantic coast, there are customs regulations for that, right? So far from banning it, the federal government sets up rules for it. So that's one way in which sort of the big picture government sanctions these things, but the states do as well, right? Now there are states everywhere in the country that would periodically try to put limits on the slave trade, but it's not really because they're morally opposed to the slave trade. It really is in part because the slave trade is actually too popular among their citizens. You have white people who are bringing in too many enslaved people at one time. State governments start to worry about that, about a rapid increase in slave population. If they are purchasing people from slave traders often take that money out of the state, so there's a capital drain. They worry about that. And none of the bans or limitations on the slave trade, none of them last for very long. You know, they'll be in place here and there for a couple of years, and then they're either rolled back or they simply just don't get enforced. And then you get down to the local level, right? And at the local level, this could sort of manifest itself in lots of ways. There are localities, for example, that collect taxes from slave sales. Not all of them, but there are bunches of them here and there. There are localities that will license slave traders, and so they'll take in money from the slave trade that way. You know, the slave traders will often buy enslaved people at sheriff's auctions. When runaways are taken up, or even suspected runaways are taken up, if no one comes to claim them, they are sold at auction. You know, lawsuits that are sometimes brought against slave traders end up in city and state court, in city and local courts. Judges are often on the side of slave traders. clerks in county courthouses are all signing documents all the time that are ratifying the slave trade. So, I mean, the book is specifically about slave traders, but part of the argument that I'm making here is that slave traders have accomplices throughout every level of American society: government officials, merchants, bankers, ship captains, purveyors of goods, blacksmiths, carpenters. I mean, everybody is sort of playing a role and taking a cut of what the slave trade has to offer. Of course, except for enslaved people, right? Who are the actual sort of core of the value here. But they, of course, see none of it.
One story that illustrates the local part of it for me is the one of Austin Woolfolk,
Yeah.
who beats up a anti-slavery man and then the judge basically says, well, you know, you should have beat him up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, Woolfolk, you know, this Benjamin Lundy was this anti-slavery editor who wrote I mean, he sort of lights into Woolfolk all the time in the newspaper. But then he publishes a story about him that really enrages Woolfolk. And Woolfolk basically tracks him down in the street in Maryland, and he beats him to the pavement right in front of a crowd of people. And makes no bones about it. He just takes off his coat and just beats the guy up. And so Benjamin Lundy sues him, and they go to court. And he's on trial. Woolfolk's on trial for assault, and the judge is like, "Yeah, I would have beat him up too." You know, he finds him guilty because he kind of has to. I mean, dozens of people saw him do this. He fines him $1. He's like, "You're guilty. You're fined $1." But honestly, you know, if anyone ever had it coming, Benjamin Lundy had it coming.
And I was going to ask you about some of the states that tried to regulate somewhat, and of course Louisiana being one. And one of the things that I found interesting was how basically Franklin, Armfield, Ballard basically do a workaround.
Yeah.
And you know, pretty much avoid the problem that's facing them in their business, seemingly pretty successfully.
Yeah, and it's not just Louisiana. This happened in Mississippi as well, right? And really, like every state in the Lower South tries it at some point or another, right? They try to regulate, or you know, what they would say is you can't. The way it worked is they would say you can't bring in enslaved people for sale, right? If you were personally the enslaver, you could bring people in for your own use. But if you were a slave trader bringing people in for sale, you couldn't do that. So there are lots of ways around that, though, right? So when Mississippi tries it, one thing that slave traders would do, right, if they were selling people in Natchez, they just go across the Mississippi River. They'll just sell people on the Louisiana side instead, and then the enslavers will bring them back to Mississippi. Everything's legal. When Louisiana tries it, and Louisiana gets ambitious about it, right? They try, not only banning the import of people for sale. They say, they create a whole list of states from which theoretically enslaved people could not be brought in at all. They tell potential slaveholders, if you want to bring enslaved people in for your own use, you have to go get them. You can't send somebody to go get them for you. Like, you can't get your son-in-law to go up to Virginia and buy people and bring them back. If you want them, you got to go get them. So they try. And Franklin and Armfield they find all kinds of sort of shady ways around. They fake bills of sale to make it seem like the sale was made, back in Virginia, and the person is bringing them in themselves. They'll sell people off the boat out sort of down the Mississippi River a little bit, and then sort of slaveholders will go collect people and then bring them, that last little bit up the Mississippi to New Orleans, to bring people in that way. They'll do things like they'll go up to Memphis and sort of register the sale in Memphis to make it look like it happened out of state, and then the owner can bring them in. So yeah, I mean, part of the reason these bans aren't successful is that they don't work.
Let's talk a little bit about, your book is about these traders. So who are these guys? Who's Isaac Franklin? Who's John Armfield and Bryce Ballard? And we inevitably have to deal with the issue of these guys are doing some incredibly loathsome things. And there's one point in your book you just say, I used to try to figure out what was going on, but they just don't care. They're just Right. I mean, and you know, so who are these guys, and how do they get into the trade, and what is their attitude about what they're doing?
Yeah, I mean, look, part of the reason that I started working on the book was that, you know, in the literature on the slave trade, and it's a growing literature. It has been for the last probably 10 or 15, 20 years at least. I mean, there's literature before that, but there's a bunch of stuff that's come out really in the last 20 years. There's not a lot on sort of who slave traders are, where they come from, why are they doing what they do. And I don't know, I find that a sort of interesting question. It seems sort of an obvious question. It strikes me that it's strange that no one tried to answer it. But one thing I discovered when at least for me, when I research these guys, part of the reason I think, you know, no one tried to answer it is I'm not sure it has an answer. You know, what exactly kind of motivates them? You know, what's the sort of psychology of slave traders? I think it is in some ways as simple as it's an opportunity for white men to make money. They don't particularly have a lot of scruples or sentiment when it comes to enslaved people. You know, the country that they live in says that black people are suitable to be enslaved, and this is sort of their role in American society. And you know, look, like most white Americans at the time, they just don't really care that much about the lives or the you know, the kind of personal circumstances, the humanity of enslaved people. It's just not their problem. Now that doesn't mean everybody was going to be a slave trader, right? You've got to go sort of an extra mile to do that, and that is some ways that was always sort of what eluded me, right? But where do they come from? I mean, they come from all over the place. That was the thing about slave traders, is they could come from almost anywhere. You know, Isaac Franklin comes from Tennessee. He's born in Frontier, Tennessee, sort of around near what's now Nashville. He is the son of a guy who is kind of a long hunter, sort of a Daniel Boone model. You know, goes out and he's sort of an Indian fighter. He's a Revolutionary War soldier. Gets land as a bounty for fighting in the war. Is a slaveholder. You know, by the time Isaac Franklin's born, you know, his parents or his family is moderately wealthy. They become much more wealthy over time. He gets involved in the slave trade with his older brothers, who start doing it sort of first decade of the 19th century. And his brothers kind of get out of it after the War of 1812, but he likes it. I mean, that's the thing about these guys, right? You couldn't do this every day unless you liked the business. And he liked it. It was profitable. He didn't seem to have a problem with the violence. If anything, he kind of likes the violence. And so, yeah, I mean, he starts, you know, he's working, bringing people from Maryland to Virginia down to Natchez, Mississippi. John Armfield is from Central North Carolina. Really, he's from Guilford County, which is the area around now what's now Greensboro. He does not come from a rich family. His family they're kind of middling farmers. His father owns several hundred acres of land. He enslaves a few people. One thing about John Armfield is John Armfield doesn't want to be a farmer. He really just, you know, his father was a farmer. Most people were farmers in that era and in that spot, but he doesn't want to do it. So when he turns 18, he leaves home. He goes maybe 50 miles away. He opens a mercantile business with the help of his brother-in-law. He does that for a couple of years. He's pretty good at that. He sort of gets chased out of town for reasons that I'll let people read the book about. And he's kind of wandering around for a couple of years. He doesn't really know what to do with himself. But he sees the slave trade in action. He runs into Isaac Franklin somewhere on the road, and he goes into the slave trade. And again, he's someone who he finds that he's good at it. He likes it. There's money in it. So he keeps doing it. And then he and Franklin, of course, join forces a few years after that. Now, Bryce Ballard comes into it in a slightly different way from the first two. Bryce Ballard is from Spotsylvania County, near what's now Fredericksburg. And what was then, I always say what's now Fredericksburg, it was then Fredericksburg too. And he comes from a family that really goes back in Virginia to the earliest years of white settlement of Virginia. His mother is a carter. but they're not the sort of rich Carters by the time he's born. He's not poor, but again, they're kind of a family that sort of small to middling farmers. And Ballard comes under the sort of tutelage of the richest man in Spotsylvania County, a man named Samuel Alsop, who is a plantation owner, a builder, a tavern keeper, somebody who's got a lot of money sitting around and he's got to figure out what to do with it. So his family and Ballard's family, they have a series of connections that I talk about in the book. And around the time Ballard is sort of 18, 20 years old, Alsop goes to him and he says, look, if I give you some money and you use it to purchase enslaved people, you know, you do the work, you make the sales, and we split the profits. What do you say? And Ballard says, okay. And he just sort of his career kind of takes off from there. So, you know, none of them sort of start their lives like as children thinking they're going to be slave traders, but pretty early on in all of their lives, they make a decision that this is something that's worthwhile. It's something I can make money at. It's something that I'm good at. It's something that I kind of like doing. So I'm going to keep doing it.
And you alluded to in your introduction that they created really these innovations in this and created this, you know, really financial machine that later traders followed. And part of that, of course, is that they knew the territory. They had someone up in the Chesapeake, you know, Franklin obviously had experience down in Mississippi. What are the other things that you would say was essentially what these later traders learned from their operation that created this, you know, pretty horrific and vast system of trade and human trafficking?
Yeah, I mean, so some of these things are innovations, and some of these are things that they actually saw. You know, we were talking about Austin Woolfolk before. Austin Woolfolk actually pioneers a lot of the things about this model. What Franklin and Armfield do is they just do it better than he does and bigger than he does. So, you know, one thing that Austin Woolfolk does, as you said, right, they've got people who are stationed in cities. You know, slave traders early in the 19th century and really long into the 19th century, sort of small timers, are kind of itinerants, right? They work in a tavern or a bar or a hotel. You know, they're sort of sitting around, you know, maybe they'll go out in the countryside if they hear rumors of people for sale. They'll kind of put an ad in the paper for a couple weeks. They'll buy up a few dozen people and then they skip town. Then they're gone, right? Maybe they come back, maybe they don't. Franklin and Armfield, though, they stay, right? And Austin Woolfolk stayed. Austin Woolfolk set up a headquarters in Baltimore. He was there all year. He's got relatives who are set up first in Georgia and then in New Orleans. They're there all the time. And Franklin and Armfield do the same thing. They set up a headquarters in Alexandria. Franklin has a place down in Natchez that's an established location. He eventually rents a couple of places in New Orleans, so he's working out of both cities there. And you knew you could find these people all the time, right? And that makes a big difference in terms of, you know, how other white people would think about them as a business person, right? It's one thing to sort of do business with some guy in a bar. It's another thing to go to a proper place of business, right? There's an office, there's a sign on the door. The guy's got an ad in the paper every day. He's going to be there, right? If something happens 3 weeks from now, he's still going to be there, right? So that's one thing that they do. They establish themselves as regular businessmen. Another thing they do that Woolfolk also did is they have a network of agents, right? They have employees who work for them. And basically what this enables them to do is cover an enormous amount of territory, tens of thousands of square miles, where, you know, they'd have agents stationed in Warrenton and Fredericksburg and Baltimore and places on the Eastern Shore and Richmond. All of them are buying enslaved people with money from the company. They're all bringing people to Alexandria, and then from Alexandria, they're shipped to the Deep South. So again, this is a sort of a multiplier effect in terms of the labor that they're able to employ. Another thing that they do is they are committed to shipping. You know, I think the image of the domestic slave trade we have in our heads is of the coffle system, right? Caravans of people in chains, in lines, being walked 1,000 miles across the continent. And that probably is the dominant model, right? That is the way most enslaved people were forcibly migrated, particularly if they were moving within an individual state, right? If you're being sold and being moved, from from Richmond to Fairfax County, right? You're not going to get on a boat for that. But if you're moving people down from Virginia to the Gulf South, you're going to send people by ship, or you could at least, and if you've got enough money. And Franklin and Armfield do. And what shipping enables them to do is it enables them to keep a supply chain going. They know exactly how long it takes. They're able to communicate with each other and say, okay, here's the invoice for the next shipment. And it's sort of a steady kind of supply, right? And it's also reliability for customers. Customers at the sales end would know that there were people who were coming, and Franklin could tell them that. But the truth is, the biggest thing that Franklin and Armfield do, the thing that makes them so successful, and I think the thing that is sort of the core of the model for all of the big traders who would come after them, it's the money. Most slave traders preferred to operate on a cash business, not just at the purchase end, right? They almost always had to operate in a cash business at the purchase end, right? If you're a slaveholder in Virginia and you're going to sell somebody, you're doing it because you need the cash. I mean, not always because you need the cash. Sometimes there are lots of reasons people sold people, but you're not going to do it on credit and wait for the slave trader to sort of come back and pay you later. It's not going to work like that. But at the sales end, slave traders also often wanted cash, right? They don't want to deal with credit. They don't want to deal with collecting debts. It was too unreliable. It was too time consuming. They needed the money so that they could go back and buy more people. But Franklin and Armfield, what they do, Franklin had been in the Deep South for so long, and he had so many established relationships with merchants and bankers and other kind of sort of leading players in that part of the country, that what he realizes he's able to do is he can take credit lines from banks. So he's got a lot of money at his disposal. And what that lets him do is he can sell more. He's still like cash, obviously, but he can sell a lot of people on credit. As long as he has money coming in from the banks, he can have money going out. And so what you got Franklin and Armfield do is they sort of loop enslaved people into this constant circulation of money and bodies, constant circulation. And by doing that, particularly for slaveholders who didn't have the cash up front, they'd be happy to buy on credit. They'll pay later. And this can put Franklin and Armfield in a tricky spot sometimes because money markets could be weird, but that those are kind of the innovations that really sort of lay the groundwork, right? Established headquarters, reliable, a sort of professionalized business, reliable supplies, networks of agents, and money.
And that I've been just taking a quick peek at some of the questions that we have been coming in, and we've gotten quite a few. Thank you. And one ties into this, and that is what's the role of the banks here? And again, it's this certainly this notion that everything is connected.
Yeah.
Even the Bank of the United States, right?
Oh yeah. I mean, so the Bank of the United States is not a bank that I think Franklin and Armfield have an account with. But the Bank of the United States, the banknotes of the Bank of the United States are the most sort of steady and reliable in the country. You could trade those at par anywhere, right? Other banknotes that came from other banks, you're often going to have to deal with those at a discount, right? And the banking system is very, very complicated. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it because I think I'll lose people. But basically, there's no single dollar, right? The dollar is the currency. But if you've got a dollar from a bank in Mississippi, you bring that dollar to a bank in Virginia, the bank in Virginia is going to say, well, the only place I can really cash this is in Mississippi. So I'm not going to give you $1 for it. I might give you 80 cents for it, right? So everybody wants the money from the Second Bank of the United States because you could trade those for $1. $1 was $1 pretty much anywhere in the country. But banks in general, yeah, I mean, they have accounts with slave traders. They like slave traders' business because they know there's always cash moving around. There's always money moving around. There are banks that are started by slave traders. There are slave traders who go into banking after they get out of the slave trade. and the money doesn't just circulate in the South, right? I mean, what Franklin would do when he's collecting money in New Orleans, for example, right? He's got an account with the Union Bank of Louisiana, for example, right, in New Orleans. Well, the Union Bank of Louisiana has a kind of partnership relationship with the Merchants Bank of New York. So what Franklin will do is he could collect money that's like a check from the Union Bank, send it up to Bryce Ballard, and now you're getting closer to New York, right? And the closer you were to the bank, the more valuable that money is. But he would tell Ballard, look, if you got the time, send it up to New York. Go get the money from there. And they would, right? So there's banks that they're dealing with not only from places like New Orleans and Natchez, but from New York, from Philadelphia. Big banking houses in England are pumping money into the Southwest because they see land and cotton and slaves as valuable investments. So slave traders are the people on the ground who are making this happen, but without the banks and without the money circulating, none of it works.
Great. So I want to turn now to, we've been talking about this machine, which underlying all of it is this horrific, human trafficking that's going on. And you talk, pretty bluntly, of course, in your book about some of the worst aspects. Well, it's all bad, but
there are. I mean, it's all worse.
There's no good here, but but certain the part I think probably a lot of people in the book will really horrify them is this whole trade in fancy girls, as they're called. What is that about?
So the short version is it's sexual slavery. I think anyone who knows anything about slavery knows that the sexual exploitation of enslaved women, assault of enslaved women, coerced reproduction, rape, these things are endemic to the way slavery works. They're systematic. I think everybody understands that. And what the one sort of kind of subset of the slave trade is, the slave traders, most of the people who they are sending to the lower South are people who are going to be put to work as field hands, right? Because most enslaved people worked as field hands. But of course, they're also selling people with skills, right? They're selling people who are, drivers and cooks and blacksmiths and carpenters. But there is a category of enslaved people who they would sell, who they would offer as what were called fancy girls. This is a term that you started to see in the 1820s and 1830s. It certainly pre-exists the term, obviously. And these are young women, often teenagers, often women who are light-skinned, who are mixed race, and they are being offered to slaveholders as sex slaves. And there are slaveholders who would pay a premium for that. And it was easily the hardest part of the book to write. It was the hardest part of the book to think about. I think it's probably consistently the most disturbing material to read. And that's saying something, because pretty much everything about the slave trade is pretty disturbing. But that's sort of one element of the slave trade business, and it's an element that Franklin and Armfield, gladly participate in. Sometimes you can see it because they'll brag about it in their letters, right? I mean, they thought this stuff was amusing. There's a real the kind of layers of pathology here they're pretty intense. But sometimes you can see it simply in the prices, right? I mean, if you look at slave sales in New Orleans, and I've got a pretty good handle on all the slave sales that Franklin and Armfield made in New Orleans. If they're selling a young adult man for, say, $600, right? And young adult men were sort of set the standard for what prices were. Well, if they're selling a 17-year-old girl for $700, there's only so many reasons that could be. And if you look in the sales records, you see it all the time. So sometimes it's plain as day. Sometimes you have to infer it, but it's as endemic to the slave trade as it was endemic to slavery itself.
One other experience of enslaved people that's in your book that I just found also really striking, and how difficult their experience must have been sort of in this very perverse relationship that they had, and that is a man named Walker and another man named William Hayden, who were essentially assistants to and enslaved by slave traders to help them in their business activities. And although, you know, the limitation of the documentation, and I've gotten a question about that too, and it's a good one, we'll address that in a little bit, doesn't really let us know too much about what they were thinking, but you do vicariously, I think, in an interesting way, talk about Williams Wells Brown, who's of course a very well-known, becomes an orator and anti-slavery activist, but who actually had this experience. And, you know, tell me about that and how he explains having to be part of this system.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, throughout the book, one thing that I try to do is, you know, the book is at its core about slave traders and a particular kind of business operation, but I don't just want it to be about that, right? You know, I try to constantly remind readers of sort of what's on the other side of this, right? And what's on the other side of this are enslaved people who are experiencing an enormous amount of trauma, who are being separated from their families and communities, who are being, you know, who are living through the hold of a slave ship, or living through walking 20 miles a day for 2 months, who are being put into forced labor on cotton plantations, who are victims of sexual assault. Whenever I can sort of get at the perspective or the stories of those people, I try to do it. And one of the more, I don't know if interesting is the right word, but one of the more striking experiences that I try to get at is exactly what you're talking about, which is that, you know, slave traders were also slave holders, right? They're not just having people who, you know, they buy somebody, they hold on to them for a couple of weeks, and then they sell them. You know, slave traders often enslave people who they have with them. Slave traders traveled a lot. They often have sort of enslaved valets who work alongside them, who are not only personal servants, but are forced to work as their assistants, essentially, right? They have to be part and parcel of making the slave trade work. And you know, we don't always have a kind of firsthand sense of what that was like, but every once in a while we do. William Wells Brown is one of those people who tells that story. William Wells Brown was effectively hired out to a slave trader in the if I remember right, I think it's the early 1840s. He works for the guy for 1 year, and he says in his narrative, he's like, it's the worst year of my life. It was only 1 year, but it was the worst year of my life. And the reason that that was true was not simply because of what he saw. And he saw some terrible things. He saw people commit suicide rather than be trafficked in the trade. He saw and had to participate in stowing people in chains on the decks of steamboats in places that he said, you know, one of the lines in the book says you could never get that part of the boat clean. I mean, truly just unbelievably horrific things that he had to see every day. But he also had to participate in those things. He had to play a role in those things. Part of his job was putting people in chains. Part of his job was making sure that people would stay on the road when they were walking. Part of his job was to be a witness to everything that this slave trader who he had to walk alongside was doing, right? I mean, this is a very sort of intimate relationship to be a personal servant in this period. And it's an impossible situation, right? It's morally fraught. There's no way to escape it. And it was something that William Wells Brown, I mean, he said it haunted him for the rest of his life. Now, you know, there wasn't anything he could do, right? I mean, I guess he could, you know, he could try to kill the guy, right? He could run away. You know, he did do things that tried to sort of ameliorate the conditions of the people who he had to be involved in trafficking. but realistically, there's only so much he can do. But he never got over the guilt from that. He didn't like to talk about it, but he felt he was obliged to write about it. But you can read in his narrative, he's like, he can't forgive himself for the things that he had to do. And John Armfield has an enslaved valet who lives with him for about 10 years. And I try to get at that, at Walker was the man's name, at Walker's experience whenever it does show up in the archives. But a lot of times what you've got to do is you've got to supplement, instead of getting at that particular experience, well, maybe you don't have that. So you've got to get at the experiences of other men who did talk about those experiences and try to sort of imagine what things must have been like.
Is it Walker who's in the carriage with him?
Yeah.
That's an amazing,
It's an amazing scene.
Moment. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So I know that so Armfield comes into, I don't even want to say possession of Walker, because he doesn't actually technically own Walker. He does enslave Walker, but Walker technically belongs to John Armfield's father, right? When John Armfield gets into the slave trade business, one of the things that his family does for him is he goes to his father and he says, look, I think I'm going to go into the slave trade. I need a couple things from you. I need you to go to your neighbors and see if they'll loan me some money, right? So you need some money up front to get started. And I also want, I'd like to take one of the young men you enslave with me as like a personal servant, as an assistant. And he really wants Walker. So he takes Walker with him really right from the beginning of his business in the slave trade. You see bits and pieces in the archives of Walker traveling with him, but there's one moment, and we know that I found a lawsuit basically that lays all of this out. And so I know Walker is his constant companion basically from about 1825 until about the middle of the 1830s. And eventually what happens to Walker is he drowns. He drowns in the Potomac River. He falls off a steamboat. But there's a moment in 1834 where John Armfield is leading a coffle of enslaved people from Virginia. He's on his way to Tennessee, and then eventually the coffle ends up in Natchez. And there's a guy named George Fanshawe who's a geologist. He's the first U.S. geologist, and he's a British guy. And he's traveling with his son, and this is part of their travel narrative. They're going into the West. They're heading over to Arkansas, actually, to take a look at the Ozarks. And in the course of their travels, they come across this coffle. And John Armfield, he walks with the coffle, really rides horseback with the coffle for a while. But then there comes a point where he wants to get off the road, right? So he books passage on a stagecoach, and he and Walker are both in the stagecoach together. And Fanshawe gets in the stagecoach, and he's bought a ticket for himself and his son, but there's only one seat left. So he asks Armfield, can your servant, get out of the stage and ride up top with the driver? And Armfield is like, no, I think he's fine. He's fine where he is. Thanks. And Fanshawe, this infuriates him, right? I mean, Fanshawe's anti-slavery, but like he's a white guy, and he expects the prerogatives of white guys to be acknowledged here. And what you see in that moment is Armfield and Walker have this relationship where Armfield sees Walker almost as an extension of himself, right? And so it's not so much that he's like protecting Walker or trying to he's looking out for his comfort. He's like, no, Walker stays with me. You got a problem with that? You can take a different stagecoach. But what you see over the course of the couple of days where they are traveling together is that Walker also pushes back. Walker will sort of make jokes at Armfield's expense to a point, right? Until Armfield starts getting pissed off, and then Walker's like, okay, that's where the line is, right? And so you get a little bit of a sense of what their relationship must have been like. You get a sense of Walker had been with Armfield long enough that he knows this guy, right? He knows how far he can push. He's going to try to push back when he can, because he's going to try to preserve some sort of dignity and self-respect. But there are limits to what he could do. And so you do see bits and pieces in the archive of that. And I I try to make as much of that evidence as I can because it's rare.
And on kind of transitioning in a similar, around the same topic, but on a little bit different attack to it, I got a great question about sources. And I know you spoke here at the library a number of years ago to actually one of our genealogical conferences. And specifically, you spoke to the question of, is it possible to trace, and how would one trace, the humanity that's involved in this trade? In terms for family history purposes, and that might gets us into the question of what does exist in terms of records to actually document that.
Yeah, and it varies. It varies pretty widely, actually. I mean, one of the many sort of tragedies, horrors, crimes of the slave trade is that it had the capacity to wipe out an enslaved person's identity, right? If you think, for example, of the experience of Solomon Northup, right? Solomon Northup is kidnapped into slavery. His name is changed, right? So if you look on a ship manifest, the name Solomon Northup doesn't appear there, right? It's Platt. I mean, it's Platt Robinson, right? It's Platt something, right? His name is changed. He's sent out into like a plantation in Louisiana. Now, Solomon Northup is lucky, right? He finds somebody who'll drop a letter in the mail to him so that people back home in New York will be like, oh, now we know where he is and now we know what his name is. But think about how many hundreds, if not thousands of people who are taken into slavery or who are enslaved. Their names are changed somewhere along the way. You never find them again. You can't even trace them in the record. It can't be done. And so the slave trade has the capacity to do that. However, because there are customs regulations, because there are, particularly in Louisiana, a system that legally entailed keeping track of slave sales, because there are lawsuits, because enslaved people resist, right? They run away, they fight back. They commit acts of violence to try to escape. They do appear in the record sometimes. And so there are ship manifests. If people are being sent on a boat from Baltimore or Alexandria or Norfolk, or they're being, they're being brought into cities like New Orleans or Mobile or Galveston. A lot of those manifests have survived, not all of them, but a fair number of them have survived. And they list people by name. They list enslaved people often by first and last name, their ages, their, however white people perceive their color description, their heights. Sometimes you can find records of at sort of the debarkation end. For example, in the city of New Orleans, there's a couple of years where there's a local regulation that says any enslaved people who are brought into the city for sale, you got to stop at the mayor's office first. You got to give us a list of who you're bringing in and where they came from. So sometimes you get lists of people in the mayor's records, and it's got the county that they come from. But even if you don't have that, right? If you have sort of, okay, here's somebody on a manifest here, here's somebody in a slave sale in a notarial record here in New Orleans, you can match those up. So you can sometimes figure out, okay, this person came from here, they're sold to this person here, and then maybe in a census record down the line, you can see, are they still there? But it's tricky. Sometimes you can put together a person's entire life story. Sometimes all you see is a name and an age on a piece of paper, and sometimes there's nothing. So it depends a lot. You have to get lucky sometimes. But the most rewarding moments, I think, in the archive are those moments where you can link the sources together, right? Where maybe you've got a ship manifest, a sale, and a lawsuit, and it's all the same person. When you do that, you can tell an enslaved person's whole story. Now, it's rare, it's difficult, But I think there's more of those stories in the archives than we probably imagine. Even though most of them are gone, I think there's more of them than we think.
And part of that question that we got also was, what does the library have? And I can just address that quickly. We do have the papers of Silas Omohundro, who is one of the major traders here in Virginia. We do have on microfilm from other collections. A lot of the Upper South private records of the traders themselves were dispersed. In fact, abolitionists often would literally take them off the desks of traders' offices with the fall of Richmond to the Union Army, and they were at the American Antiquarian Society, and they're at Chicago History Museum, and we do have collected some of those copies of some of those records. And so we do have, and one other thing I want to mention, and I think is a really important program or project, enslaved.org is a large project that's launching in Michigan, and the library actually just is going to be collaborating with them on an NEH grant, and I'm sure many other organizations are too. This is an attempt to bring together a lot of these records that are now scattered across a whole range of institutions across the United States. While we're on that, we can transition, I think, now to we have some great questions.
Sure,
one I'm getting frequently, which is a perfectly reasonable one, since we're, probably a lot of Virginians are tuning in. There's been a lot of talk here in Richmond, of course, about the slave trade here. And so that brings us kind of to the end of your story, right, Josh, which is these guys retire, and the center of the Upper South trade then comes down into Richmond. Can you kind of talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so, as I said from the outset, one of the things that the book describes is how, the slave trade is not static, right? I think we sort of imagine that, even if you have in your head, okay, there is a domestic trade, you sort of figure, okay, well, there's a domestic trade, right? It's sort of, people are traded, right? And that's how it goes. But it's not stagnant, right? Because slavery is not stagnant. Slavery moves, right? Slavery is growing in some places, it's shrinking in others. The boundaries of the nation are expanding. They're expanding with the Louisiana Purchase, they expand with Indian removal, they expand into Texas, they expand across the Mississippi River. And as slavery moves, and as the economy shifts over time, the slave trade itself moves. So very early on in the 19th century, sort of the core of the slave trade are places like Baltimore, right? Like Maryland, parts of really the Upper South, maybe extending down through the District of Columbia. And then by the 1820s, when Franklin and Armfield, really get involved, it's kind of Northern Virginia. But what you see is sort of a slow but steady movement of the center of slavery, sort of south and west over time with the growth of the cotton economy, right? So, when you look at sort of, demographics in a state, places like Maryland and Virginia are pretty consistently places where more enslaved people are being taken out than are coming in, or are being born sometimes. Even sometimes the birth rate doesn't even outpace the number of people who are being trafficked in the slave trade. But over the course of time, you start to see places like Kentucky become net exporters, Tennessee. By the late antebellum period, even like parts of Alabama are net exporters of the slave trade. But the core of the slave trade, the big centers of it, would always be in the Upper South. And it goes sort of steadily over time from Baltimore to Alexandria. There's a brief moment after Franklin and Armfield retire where it sort of flips back to Baltimore a little bit, because they were so powerful that they're the center of gravity. And when they get out, there's a vacuum for a little while. But by really by the time the economy starts bouncing back from the Panic of 1837, right, you get mid 1840s and into the 1850s, Richmond is really the core of the Upper South slave trade. New Orleans is always the biggest place in the Lower South for slave sales and for imports from other parts of the country. Natchez is sort of behind New Orleans. But by the time you get to the 1850s, the slave trade has made its way geographically down the coast, and Richmond is really sort of the heart of the beast.
And while we're sort of talking about sort of these guys getting out, this gets us, I think, more into the conversation about legacy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like there are institutions, including educational institutions, that some of these men funded.
Yeah.
What and by the way, I also had another question that ties into this a little bit. Well, maybe we can separate the two, but I know that you did contact to some of the descendants of some of these traders.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a question about, have you contacted them, and what would that conversation go like?
Which one you want to answer first?
Well, let's do it. Let's go with that one. Let's talk about
Okay.
that, because
So neither Isaac Franklin nor John Armfield have direct living white descendants. Armfield and his wife never had children. Franklin and his wife do have children. None of them lived past the age of 12. But John Armfield did effectively take in some, so he marries one of Franklin's nieces, sort of in 1834. So they'd been partners for a long time by that point, but he marries one of Franklin's nieces. And he effectively takes in some of his wife's nieces and nephews as their own children. They raise them as their own for a variety of reasons. So, and Isaac Franklin, for his part, also had a very big family. He had 9 brothers and sisters. So there are a lot of descendants of Isaac Franklin's family. There are a lot of descendants of people who were raised by John and Martha Armfield. Bryce Ballard had 3 daughters. They did live to adulthood. In fact, they lived for a long time. Some of them lived into the early 20th century. I suspect that Bryce Ballard has living white descendants. I'd be very surprised if he doesn't. I don't know who they are. I chose not to trace them or track them down. And I made that decision because I felt like if they don't know, I mean, do I want to be the historian who knocks on the door one day and says, was your great grandfather, Bryce Ballard? Is that you? Yeah. Do you know about him? I don't want to be that guy, right? Because I don't know how that conversation is going to go, right? It could be entirely possible that somebody would react quite badly to that. Or it's possible that the descendants do know. And if they do, maybe they'll read the book, maybe they'll reach out to me, maybe they'll be in contact with me, but I chose not to try to track them down. The descendants of Franklin and Armfield, though, I did get in touch with them. Basically, the short version is there was a Facebook group that I came across that was dedicated to descendants of Isaac Franklin's father, James Franklin Sr. I emailed the administrator of the group. I was a little wary of doing it, but I figured just sending an email, right? I mean, what's the worst that could happen? And the woman who was the administrator wrote back to me right away. She introduced me to several of her relatives. I've been in touch probably with at least half a dozen descendants over the course of writing the book. And, I don't want to put words in their mouth, but my sense from every conversation that I've had with them is that a lot of them didn't know this growing up. They didn't know, like, there might be some money in the family. I mean, none of them I think are extravagantly wealthy, but there might have been some money in the family. They didn't really know where it came from. Nobody really talked about that part of the, where the family money was from. And now that they found out, and they didn't find out from me, they sort of knew by the time I got in touch with them. But my sense is that they really feel a lot of responsibility, a lot of burden. I don't think necessarily guilt. They might put it that way. I don't know that that's the feeling exactly, but they feel like, look, this is the legacy that they bear, and they, my sense from them has always been that they want to do something about that. They feel responsible for doing something about that, for doing some sort of reparative justice work, for doing some sort of reconciliation work, whatever that looks like. But it's, I can only imagine what that feeling must be like, to know that this is your great grandparents were these men, or were making money in the way that these men made money. It's a hard thing to have to face. And it's nothing they did, right? It's literally what they were born into, but nonetheless, it's what you were born into. And so I think it's been interesting talking to them over the years.
And let's address the second part. So there is a university connection to Armfield, I believe.
Several. So
Yeah.
there's a university connection to Armfield, and there's a university connection to Franklin. So Armfield, after he gets out of the slave trade later in his life, he becomes pretty close with a number of Episcopalian bishops in the South. And one of those bishops, Leonidas Polk, and another one named James Odie, they decide in the late 1850s that they want to found a university that would be a pro-slavery university. It would train sort of young Episcopalian men in the values of kind of Southern Episcopalianism, and it would insulate them from what they feared were the influence of abolitionists at Northern schools. And that university is founded in the late 1850s. The original meetings for it are held at John Armfield's resort hotel that he runs in the Tennessee mountains. He is on several committees that are kind of getting the university off the ground. He gives a lot of money. He's one of the sort of the original benefactors of the university, as is Isaac Franklin's widow, and her second husband. They are also benefactors of the university. And that university is today, it's Sewanee. It's the University of the South. And they're aware of this. This is something that's part of their sort of project of kind of the history of slavery at Sewanee. They know this history. The other connection is after Isaac Franklin died, his widow inherited the vast majority of his estate, which was substantial. She then remarried to a plantation owner from Louisiana who was also very wealthy. And they built a mansion in what was then just outside of Nashville. Now it's actually inside Nashville city limits. It was the Belmont Mansion, and the Belmont Mansion was where Belmont University started. And the Belmont Mansion is still on the grounds of Belmont University. So yeah, there are these kind of institutional sort of direct connections. The other sort of really kind of legendary one is Isaac Franklin's plantations in Louisiana, which he gets involved in the 1830s, sort of as he's getting out of the slave trade. Those became the core of what's now the Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola. So there are these kind of direct institutional connections. And those really aren't the only ones. There are a few other ones that can be traced too. But what's interesting in some ways is not just these kind of direct institutional connections, right? Because a question I often get is, okay, what happened to the money? And I think when people ask that, they want to know, or what institutions are still living off that money? Are there families that are still living off that money? And I think the answer to that question is yes. But to me, I actually think that the answer is the money is everywhere. The money that is taken out of the slave trade and extracted from enslaved people, from their labor, from their commodity values, none of that goes back to enslaved people, right? When the Civil War ends, slavery ends, but it's not like if an enslaved person in 1860 was worth $1,000 on the open market, the government didn't give them $1,000. They never gave them any back wages for all the work that they'd been forced to do. Instead, all that money that had been extracted through the institution of slavery over time, all the money that had been spun off from investments in enslaved people and everything they produced, that money goes all over the country. It goes all over the world, right? Where's the money? The money's everywhere. The money is all around us all the time. That's the answer.
Have any of these institutions, particularly the universities, taken any steps in terms of thinking about what some kind of reparation might look like, or have they not? I know other universities like Georgetown have done that. Do you know of any efforts with any of these institutions?
So I don't know a lot about what's going on at Belmont. My sense is that Belmont is, my sense from what I've heard, and to be fair, I have not looked in depth into this, but from what I've heard from people who have sort of looked into this, is that Belmont as an institution is very hesitant to kind of acknowledge or grapple with this history. The University of the South, though, is at sort of the other end of the spectrum. The University of the South has had a commission for several years. They have a very robust effort to kind of grapple with the history. I do think that they've started instituting some elements of reparative justice, sort of along the lines of what Georgetown has done. There is a website for the Slavery Project at Sewanee, which you can look up and you can go to and check it out. I think it's something slavery, something and reconciliation. But if you use the right Google terms, you'll find it pretty quick. So it varies, like every sort of institutional reckoning varies. But I think from what I've seen, the University of the South has taken this quite seriously, and it's an ongoing project. They're not done by a long
shot. We also had a question about the fancy girls, and the question is this for breeding, or is it really just personal, as a personal sex slave, is the way the question is framed here. And of course, so that's the question. And I particularly bring that one forward. We have a lot of questions, understandably, because it's something we've been asked about this question of slave breeding as a an organized activity. What's your
I hate even sort of these terms. Really kind of, they gross me out. To put it bluntly, they're really foul. But I understand the question. So the answer, I think, to the best that I think we've been able to understand, is that interference by slaveholders in the reproductive lives of enslaved people is rampant. And that can take a lot of forms. It can take the form of rape and sexual assault, right? Which really isn't usually about reproduction. It's obviously about sort of power and violence and authority. But it can result, obviously, in children. It sometimes takes the form of sort of forcing enslaved people to be together, to be couples, to try to reproduce. Enslaved women and enslaved men, both of them, their reproductive lives are not always within their control, and that was because slaveholders understood that the more enslaved people reproduced, the more valuable their slaveholding would be. Now, that's not the same thing as what I think is in some people's heads, which is the idea that there's a kind of systematic effort, that is almost secondary to sort of farm production, of trying to make more and more enslaved people through forced reproduction. The evidence for that is very spotty. It's mostly anecdotal. It's certainly not implausible. It certainly fits with what our understanding of how slavery worked was. But the notion that it's that the breeding of enslaved people like they were farm animals, that was something that was happening all the time and it's widespread, that's a little bit different from the idea of sort of interference in family lives and coerced reproduction, right? Those things absolutely happened. Things like sort of what you have in your head as almost like a sort of like farm animals. I hate these. This kind of conversation is just really, it's really foul. it's something that I think is less common than we imagine, but certainly not something that is beyond the realm of possibility. But I think it's mostly anecdotal.
And maybe this kind of ties into it. There's a question that someone was looking at the Constitution of the Confederate States of America and noticed that they also made the Atlantic trade illegal. And I'm assuming some of the answer to that is that this, in a way, the U.S. slave system was one of the few where there was a very high level of reproduction, right? So
there's a lot of reasons why they banned the transatlantic trade, right? There are some slaveholders, particularly in the lower South, who in the 1850s talk about reopening the transatlantic trade, right? There's a movement for that, particularly in places like South Carolina, which has a slave majority. But there's a number of reasons, and I don't think these are the only reasons, why the Confederacy keeps the ban on the transatlantic trade that existed it doesn't exist in the federal Constitution, but it's put in place in federal law 20 years after the federal Constitution. So one reason is that the transatlantic trade was illegal, and it was something that the British government kept an eye on, right? The British government is actively operating to try to shut down illegal transatlantic slaving. If the Confederacy wants an alliance with Great Britain and recognition by Great Britain as an independent nation, getting involved in the slave trade is not going to do that, right? It's counterproductive to what the Confederacy wants, to reopen the slave trade. But there's another issue at stake, which is the linkages between the Upper South and the Lower South. One of the things that's happening on the eve of the Civil War is, I think everybody knows there's this division between ideas about secession, not just within individual states, right, where there's lots of intrastate division, but the states of the Lower South are far more ready to go than the states of the Upper South are. And one of the things that the states of the Lower South do during the secession winter, right, when they send those secession commissioners up to the Upper South to try to persuade the Upper South to get out of the Union, is they tell them, look, if you stay in the Union, I don't know where you think you're going to be selling all these enslaved people who you've been selling to us for decades, right? That market, we're going to shut that market to you. And so the slave trade is actually a tool that's used by secessionists to try to pull the Upper South into the Confederacy. Now, how effective that is, how much of a role that plays, that's sort of a separate question. However, if the states of the Upper South see in the Confederate Constitution, wait, you're going to try to be importing people from Africa again? What is that going to do to our market? No, we're not going to go, right? So there are several reasons having to do with both geopolitics and with the domestic politics of the Confederacy that are several reasons why they keep the ban in place. And again, like the ban itself, morals is a very, very tiny part of that equation.
One of the things that people have asked us, and I wonder if, and I realize this is quite a bit beyond the bounds of your book, so I understand if you might not have any experience with this, but is this question of generational trauma, which has I think people clearly understand that exists, and there is some theorizing that it can come down through multiple generations. Do you know of people who are really working in this field professionally to look at what this meant? What are the effects? Are there effects today that we can talk about in terms of the Black family, for instance, that people are actually studying?
So I have not sort of looked into that extensively at my end, right? Personally, I don't do research like that. I haven't read a lot of research like that. I certainly know there are people who investigate sort of the generational legacies of slavery in terms not only of things like like wealth creation, but in terms of sort of healthcare outcomes, um, things along those lines. And I'm absolutely positive there are people who take a look at kind of the psychological implications of that. The generational trauma, I think, from the institution of slavery, I think is quite real. But no, it's not something that I sort of personally have spent a lot of time looking at. It's not something that as a historian I'm really trained to look at.
Sure, I totally understand. And I would say if the person who asked that question is still with us, drop us an email, because I do, and it's been 5 years, so I don't recall, but I know that at one of our genealogical conferences, we actually did have somebody who came to speak on that topic. So would love to go back through my notes and find that contact for you. And it was somebody here in Richmond as well. Let's see, let's look one more time at our questions. We're getting ready to wrap up, so maybe we'll do one or two more. One thing that a couple people were interested in is, was there any relationship here with what is the role of indigenous people in terms of either being enslaved themselves or as participants in the system of slavery? And did they have that was there any effect in terms of this, the slave trade you're talking about regarding indigenous
there really
people?
isn't a lot of evidence of that in terms of the sort of the slave trading operations that I looked at. Certainly, Native nations participated in slavery. People of Native nations were enslaved. There is a body of literature about Indian slavery and the Indian slave trade. Certainly there are people of at least partial Native descent who are enslaved. It's a related question, but it's almost sort of a side question to the study of the domestic slave trade. But the short answer is yes, of course. I mean, indigenous people of various kinds are involved in slavery in various ways, but there's really like a whole separate literature on that I'd recommend taking a look at the work of Christina Snyder, Andre Resendez. It's a new book out by what's her name? Is it Elena Roberts? Is that her name? I think it's a brand new book out about Indians and slavery. So there's plenty of stuff out there. It's really I don't want to get too far into it because it gets me out of my depth very quickly.
And sort of bring it back around to, I guess, the scholarship that both of us have worked on. I had a good question. It was about what you hope that descendants of people who were trafficked and people of color generally could take from your book. But I would also ask the question kind of in alignment with that is, since your focus really is on these traders, what other books could you recommend that tell part of the rest of this, maybe more intimately, the story of the enslaved and others that would complement your book?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, right? Because my book is, it is obviously centered on traders and the lives of traders and the business operation of traders. And I do try very, very hard to balance that story with the story of enslaved people themselves for a lot of reasons. I think it's inherently important. I think whenever we can recover the voices of enslaved people, they ought to be heard. I think that grappling with the very sort of human experiences of people who were trafficked, that it's one thing to sort of talk about sort of the horrors of the slave trade. I mean, everybody knows the slave trade was terrible, right? Everybody knows slave traders were terrible, but work on the slave trade it very easily devolves into nothing but sort of numbers and dollars and the mechanics of the trade. But I think it's important to always remember, look, there's the other side of this is not dollars and numbers of people on a ship manifest. It's people on a ship manifest. right? And so I want to make sure that that's always there to the extent that it's possible. But I acknowledge that like the book is not, that's not the center of the story that I'm telling. And I think there are other books that do sort of complement what I'm doing in a lot of ways. I think Dinah Barry's book, The Price for Their Pound of Flesh, does a good job of that. There's a book by a guy named Damian Pargas that does that, that really is a lot about enslaved people and their experiences as they, as they're looking at the trade and trying to figure out, can I fight back? How do I adjust to being trafficked? All these things. Calvin Schemmerhorn's first book, what is it? Money Over Mastery, Family Over Freedom. It's something like that. Is a lot, does a lot with this. Ed Baptist's book, The Half Has Never Been Told, does a pretty good job of doing that. I mean, it's a lot about sort of the relationship between slavery and capitalism, but there's a lot I think in similar ways that I do, maybe probably even more than I do, where he's sort of trying to make sure that the stories of the enslaved themselves are a big part of that narrative. So so those are just a few.
And perhaps Walter Johnson's book.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Soul by Soul is another sort of good version of that, which is really just, it's mostly about the slave trade in New Orleans itself. But it's about it's really about sort of how slave sales were this constant sort of negotiation and between, traders, customers, and the enslaved, and how enslaved people are sort of, sort of engaged in trying to shape their own sales to the best that they can. So yeah, that book does a good job of it too.
Well, where time is almost up, I want to thank everyone who came. And by the way, we had a good recommendation from one of our participants. And I hope I pronounced this correctly, but there's Dr. Joy DeGroy. It's Gruy, who is an expert on what she calls post-traumatic slave syndrome. She has a website that you can go to. And I will follow up with another one of our participants who asked about the person who presented here. I do want to thank you all for doing this. We all are adjusting, I guess, to the virtual realm in terms of all of the programming that we're doing. But the good news is we can reach out to so many people in so many places. And although I miss seeing people physically here at the library, we really do thank you for coming and asking a lot of really, really good questions. And just one more time, I want to just thank Dr. Rothman for being with us here tonight.
Thank you, Greg. Thanks to everybody for sticking around, asking questions, being interested in the book. I appreciate it.
And I want to thank Emma Ito, who works with our education department, for helping us with all the logistics for this, and she's with us here tonight as well. So have a good evening, and thank you for attending.